Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Saidia. Thank you so much. I don't know what I can speak after all these words, otherwise pray, or keep alive the conversation about love. Also, I'd like to thank you, Rashida, Simone, Saidia, and Tina, for the invitation to be part of this group of the impossible. We are impossible. This is then a refugee text that tries to give a voice to its own captivity, dry, airless, throbbing, and smoking. And it is spread by the observation of Saidia Hartman when she says that black girls came before the law, but they were not protected by it. Whether I was looking for this refugee or not, I only find out by writing. As I went back and forth in sentences that seemed unsolvable to me, like the one that says, without justice, there can be no love. Or the another one that said that knew intuitively that love had already been defeated by violence. Wrapped by a list of artists, 14,000 of square meters of São Paulo Biennale. This landscape reminds me of the conversation we had together, Saidia and I, at New York University a few months ago. Moment that I also tried to write about love and violence in the midst of reflections about curatorship or on curatorship. Unlikely equation between institutionality or the institutionality of the profession versus the explosion of the reflection that derives from intimate life. The proposal was to honor the invitation to exchange with Saidia some reflections on how her practice had crossed mine. And that goes through the question of how to write a history of art without a history. And that takes place between and through language. A story without a history, with Cape Hate, and that at that moment appeared like a story that presented itself not like my heartbroken expected, but as the author says, a history that is constituted from their own place with utopia. And that ends up remind us how our loves take us in such a way that they make us perform the unimaginable, o inimaginável. I, for example, never imagined having to change secrets so that she, a former protagonist, could never enter again. É esse imaginável, inimaginável, unimaginable, therefore that overflows an episteme, wishing to recompose itself as a performance via this body and this voice, from the experience of what's told and lived. Returning to the text How by Denise Ferreira da Silva, and that the dear colleague Namaduma also highlighted yesterday, which tell us that the intellectual and creative doings of Black women are at the same time a feat, a deed, a burden, and an artifact. I began the way your thesis pillars ends when she suggests that we rewrite our monstrosity, or monstruosidade, a way yet to find ways to say, or being implicated with what I have been calling the birth of form, or even to narrate through her who have been called the character of a writer of a history that speaks. Someone with whom I can insist on my first question about love when asks me, what does existing outside the norm have to do with break the form itself? Since I went back in time so much, I take the opportunity to tell you how I ended today, what I start on that oceanic day. I remember to this day my scrambled visions, the exclamations that appeared between the barricades, the dogs, the children, and the excitement causing me by the way in which her thoughts arrived. It's a quote. What's repeated in the body, in the voice, is an episteme. What is repeated in the body, in the voice, is episteme. I presented a handful of feelings while quoting Brazilian writer Leida Maria Martins, to help me reflect on love as an episteme. As I write, I even tried to rescue the papers with these notes, but the papers are now all packaged, and so many boxes and removals. In this insistent search to also understand hate, I ended up finding some other words of mine that in part I don't recognize, especially those words that in guilty I only recognize my lack of limits without even noticing yours. Thinking about limits soon led me to resort to bell hooks words. I was looking for the new perspectives that would tell me all about love. Comfort and discomfort had appointments with me through her words, especially the sentence that says, "Without justice, there can be no love." A famous phrase from this author that we also love, and that has as a context the relations of power in children's domestic education. In this sense, taking account that according to the author, the home, whatever it may be, is the original school of love, we can agree that the love we learn will always be nourished by the violence of the home. A violence that, being generative, demands, she also emphasized, a call for justice. However, I haven't told you yet that the conversations about love and about limits had already started with Denise Ferreira da Silva, the same summer in New York, and in previous seasons, which made me conclude that the call for justice becomes a demand sustained by the moment when violence both accomplishes and reveals the failure of justice. I'm referring to the failure of justice to carry out, for example, the principles of equality and liberty, which is what the author reminds us of. I will then locate the relationship of justice within what I can circumvent, that is, yours and my limits. And I do this already assuming that we all know that the home, as the center of the patriarchal and cis-heteronormative performance, implies an act of violence. It doesn't matter whether in your gesture of your claim or in your attempt to escape. Romantic love cannot conquer everything. Perhaps the heroic gesture of conquer everything was our failure. The heroic gesture of doing justice, doing justice with our own hands and fingers, screams, pleasures, squeeze, and hugs, took us precisely to the moment when violence both accomplished and revealed the failure of justice. As I try to formulate this passage that will come now, I get the feeling that it looks like I'm joking. But I have studied and taken this exercise seriously. Love always seems to be a game. A repetition of words of the value of your knowledge. And it's only when it reaches its end, when it becomes adult, legal, and serious, that you listen to insistent shouting. What is repeated in the body, in the voice, is an episteme. So I live in doubt if I'm knowing loving within the limits of justice, or if I'm knowing love the limits of justice. As I'm doubt of time, I will welcome the feeling that I'm profound Denise's consideration to continue the conversation with bell hooks. Considering that impossibility of justice is what structures Black existence, considering that impossibility of just structures love relationships between Black women and dissident bodies, could love exist? Here I arrive at the moment where, for me, claim time as an entity is claiming the future of love. Tempo, demboa, okitembo, his spiraling knowledge, is what also makes believe in the advice of my many dear friends. Also, in Denise's wisdom, when convoking our imagination, says that knowing within the limits of justice is simultaneously a knowing and a doing. It is a praxis that destabilizes what has come to be, but which does not provide a guide for what, yes, is yet to come. From the paranoid questions I did and undid until I got here, like a very anxious one that said, "What do you have left?" Or another one which insisted on saying, "But what are the bearable limits of violence in the relationship between two survivors?" Or yet another one that got stuck in the text that we threw to the wind and asked, "What words do you confuse with love?" All these questions led me to the answer that a friend and rapper in song seemed to answer for me. Rico Dalassan says, "Everything I know about love I invented." A sound that opens me up to the possibility of imagining what love can come to be, and that refers both to what I learned in the houses I lived in, and to what, like the limits of justice, needs to be reimagined. For this possible that opens up, I end up taking with me 3 points. Returning to the reflection about knowing within the limits of justice and defining limits, not in the sense of what justice cannot, but as the line in which justice comes to be, I open the first question. If justice, when addressed in the economic and legal side, is immanently limited in limiting of the relationships between people it comprises, could you say that the search of justice to make love possible would in itself be its frontier? The case is that the love I learned in violence and from violence, from a social affective situation that was ancestrally repeated, had already taught me that love would not save us from the impossibility of justice. And today, it seems to me that out of love or fear, we wanted to provide it, or to prove it. Love or fear? That's the second question. I'm always asking and repeating, what words do you confuse? Perhaps the impossibility of justice shaped a type of love that tried to resolve itself in the very fear of injustice, injustiça, of the fear of death, morte. A class problem, a gender problem, a sexuality problem, a race problem, an environment problem, a category problem, all with the generational and generative violence. The romantic structure of relationships seems to me to have been at the basis of the very salvationist idea and the heroic idea of doing justice. The heroic gesture of doing justice with our own hands and fingers, screams, pleasure, squeezes, and hugs. And finally, my third and final question is the impossibility of dealing with our excess, the excess carried in the sexual body of the native slave woman that Denise talks about, a consequence of our direction to make love a productive regime? Has our desire just become a threat to the achievement of colonial and national juridical economic goals? Was disamour, was loveliness our punishment? I go back and forth with bell hooks talking about true love. Was this the text for true love? A reversal for true love? In this improvisation, we can simply say that we weren't ready and maybe never would be. To love what you learned to love, the way you learned to love with fear. I end with the feeling that what I know about love, I invented. That's why what that day is here with you remind me of. Acts of faith, revolt, rebellion. Thank you.